Welcome to the Rotary Club of Scituate, Massachusetts. We'll have more people joining us. I'm sorry they're a little bit late. But for those of you who don't know too much about the Rotary, Scituate Rotary, we meet twice a month. We meet on the second Wednesday and the fourth. So, and we start our meeting always with the Pledge of Allegiance, and we also have a four-way test that we all recite. So, and we usually have a great big bell, which is somewhere. So I'm just going to do this. We're going to start the meeting. And Walter, will you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
United States of America.
And to the republic.
And for which it stands.
Indivisible.
One nation.
One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Liberty and justice for all.
For all. And the four-way test of all the things we say and do. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it bring goodwill and better friendship? And will it be beneficial for all concerned? So thank you. Thank you for being here. We have a terrific guest tonight, and all of you know that this month is Polio Month, and we've actually, it's been Jean who corralled this. She's a Rotarian also. I'm going to have Jean do all the introductions, but we're very happy that you're here tonight with us, Kathryn. So Jean, why don't you take it away?
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for being here tonight. We've got a wonderful speaker who I actually became acquainted with, oh gosh, maybe 6 months ago, wasn't it, Kathryn?
Yes, about that time.
Yep, Kathryn came in and did a presentation for the Scituate Historical Society. And in our conversation, we started to talk about Rotary, and then one thing led to another. So here she is tonight. So I'll tell you just a little bit about Kathryn, and then she can go a little further. Kathryn is a past president, I believe, and a member of the Anderson, South Carolina Rotary Club. Is that correct?
That's correct.
She is also one of the first women inducted into the Rotary in the late 1980s. So that's pretty cool. I think that's pretty cool. Anyways, she's been involved in World Rotary's effort to eradicate polio called Polio Plus. And she does this presentation she's going to do as Missy Lahan, who was actually FDR's personal secretary, and she will tell us all about FDR and the how he eradicated polio and how the Rotary works to eradicate polio. And I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to let Missy Lahan take over.
Well, thank you so much, Jean. Well, FDR certainly sends his regards to all of you and is very excited and thrilled that Rotary has taken on the polio cause as one of its own, because as you know, it is very, very dear to the president's heart. And he sends his thanks and his great appreciation. And if you're ever in Washington, stop by the White House, ask for me, and I'd be glad to introduce you if he's around. So anyway, I'm supposing that most of you are Massachusetts natives, perhaps. I'm not quite a native. I was born in Potsdam, New York, but I moved to Somerville, the little suburb of Boston called Somerville, when I was a little girl. And I suppose that all of you know that Somerville is adjacent to a very much better known community called Cambridge. And what is in Cambridge? What institution of higher learning, I should say, is in Cambridge?
Harvard.
Harvard, very good. And who do we know who went to Harvard?
Did he? FDR?
Yes, he did. He did indeed. He was a graduate in the class of 1905. And at the time he was attending Harvard, my mother sometimes took in Harvard students as boarders just to make ends meet in our household. But we never had Mr. Roosevelt as one. His mother had probably better arrangements made for him.
Mhm.
And so I did not meet him at that time, but I continued going to the public schools in Somerville, studied secretarial science. And when I graduated in 1917, we had just entered the Great War. So wanting to do my bit for my country, I took the civil service exam and I was sent to Washington to work for the Department of the Navy. Now, at that time, the Secretary of the Navy was a newspaper publisher from Raleigh, North Carolina, named Josephus Daniels. And I have to say, he knew nothing about Navy matters. He called all ships boats, and really his only interest was to abolish sin in the Navy, which, if you have ever known a sailor, was a very tall order. What he did initially was to ban anything stronger than coffee from all the Navy ships, bases, even the officers' mess. And that's why we still refer to coffee up to this day as a cup of Joe, after Josephus Daniels.
Mhm.
But fortunately, Mr. Daniels identified a very able assistant secretary of the Navy who knew all sorts of things about ships, and that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had grown up on the water on the Hudson River, had his first sailboat as a very small child, was a great devotee to American history. John Paul Jones was his hero. And he came to Washington to certainly add a lot to that situation. Now, I was only at the Navy, at this Department of the Navy, for about 3 weeks. So I never really met him then. It was a little embarrassing. I was working in the stenography secretarial pool, and all I did all day long was I was given sheets of paperwork, letters and communications and the stuff that I had to translate from stenography to typing to words. And because we were in the middle of a war and everything was very secret, nothing had anything to do with the page before. So I just spent the whole day typing and deciphering, and I'd go home with my head pounding and my shoulders aching, and I had no idea what I'd done all day. Well, my roommate at the boarding house was also working in that department. And one beautiful day, much like today, we decided to play hooky. And we went to Mount Vernon to visit the home of the father of our country, George Washington. And when we got back, there was a Navy nurse sitting on the steps of our boarding house. And she said, "You don't look sick to me." So we both had to have a physical with a Navy doctor. My roommate got into terrible trouble because she was in perfect health, but I had a heart murmur because I had had rheumatic fever as a child. So they sent me off to Philadelphia to work in a less strenuous job that still supported the war effort. Well, in 1920, I received a letter from a man I'd met at the Navy Department who was looking for a good girl to help out in New York City at the campaign headquarters of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was running for president. Vice president, I'm sorry, he was on the ticket with James M. Cox, the former governor of Ohio. And he asked if I could help out. I said, sure. I had no other prospects at the time. And besides, I had a cousin in the Bronx who let me sleep on the couch. So I worked all through the campaign, saw very little of Mr. Roosevelt because he was crisscrossing the country on trains, giving speeches. He gave 1,000 speeches during that fall campaign between August and November. But unfortunately, it was just all for nothing because everyone was sick of the Democrats. We're sick of Woodrow Wilson, the Great War, the League of Nations, and if they could have blamed the entire Spanish flu epidemic on the Democratic Party, they could have. And that was what ushered in Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge, as you would know, had been the governor of our base state into office. Oh my goodness, I have to say that in my personal estimation, Mr. Harding was the worst president in New York in modern American history, but of course there's still that decision has not quite been made yet. So anyway, Mr. Roosevelt, knowing he needed to do something in between another opportunity to run for president, decided to form a law firm with another attorney on Wall Street. I had been invited up to help with the correspondence after the election ended, and he and I got along so well that he asked me if I might become his private secretary. So, are there any lawyers in the room or any relatives of lawyers in the room? Raise your hands. Don't be shy. Anyone? None? I didn't think so. You look like such nice people. So anyway, Mr. Roosevelt, I told him, I really don't want to be working for a law firm. I find the law work very dull. And he said to me, "Oh, Missy," that was my nickname by then. "Oh, Missy, don't worry, there'll be other things to do. Just come along. We'll have a grand time." And indeed we did. I worked for him, and we worked on matters with the Boy Scouts, which he was very involved in, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and of course, trying to pull the Democratic Party back from the edge of destruction. And I got so good at the law firm, I started getting letters addressed to Marguerite Land, Esquire. But all of that came to a crashing halt in August 1921 when Mr. Roosevelt was diagnosed with poliomyelitis. He was on vacation with his family on off the coast of Maine at Campobello Island. He came down with a high fever, and over the next few days, he was paralyzed from his shoulders down. Eventually, that improved to the point that it was settling in his legs and hips, and he did everything he could over the next few years to be able to walk again. He was not having much success until 1924. He went to the Democratic Convention and ran into an old Harvard classmate, George Foster Peabody, a man from Georgia, who owned a very decrepit old watering hole called the Meriwether Inn in the little town of Warm Springs. And he shared with Mr. Roosevelt a very intriguing story about a polio survivor named Louis Joseph, who had exercised in the warm mineral springs there and had eventually been able to walk with just a cane. Well, Mr. Roosevelt, that was his hope, that he could eventually walk with just a cane. So in the fall of 1924, he packed me and his wife, Eleanor, and a young man named Roy Jones, who served as his valet. And we went all the way down from New York City to the little town of Warm Springs, Georgia. Well, I have to tell you, as a city dweller, it was quite a shock. Warm Springs was 10 miles from the nearest paved road. There were not many utilities there, not much indoor plumbing, not much electricity, not much phone service. Quite a lot of moonshine, however. And we were not there very long when Mrs. Roosevelt just reached the end of her ability to hang on, let's say. We went to get some chicken for supper and discovered that we had to buy the chickens on the hoof. Well, we came back with the chickens in the car, just squawking and clucking, and the cook prepared them for dinner. Mrs. Roosevelt, having witnessed the chicken execution, couldn't eat a bite. She said it was just too personal. So the next morning, as we were having our coffee, she said to me, "Oh, Missy, suppose that Franklin wants steak for dinner tonight? Whatever shall I do?" I guess she thought we would just have to butcher one in the yard. Okay, I made that part up about the steak. It's not true, but the chickens were true. And Mrs. Roosevelt did get back on the train and went back to New York. After all, she had 5 children to look after, as well as many, many other causes she was pursuing. So I stayed there with Mr. Roosevelt and Roy, and he was loving the waters. The mineral pools in Warm Springs ran 89 degrees year round. They were buoyant with magnesium, and he found that he could stay in the pool for hours at a time without muscle cramps and the other things he'd experienced up in the north. And eventually he could be able to stand in water up to his mid-chest without support. He could hold on to a rope, take a few steps, and he was just thrilled to feel his toes move for the first time since 1921 when he was stricken. He was interviewed by a reporter for the Atlanta Journal, and he gave an interview saying that he hoped to swim his way back to health. Well, we departed for the north to spend the winter, and when we came out the next March, there were all these polio patients waiting for us because they had read the article, which had been syndicated nationwide, and wanted to swim their way back to health too. Well, there were no doctors there, no nurses, nobody but me and FD. Didn't stop him. He just proclaimed himself old Doc Roosevelt and deputized me. I was Nurse LaHand. And we'd get in the water with those patients and just help them move around as best they could, strengthen the muscles they had that worked, and build their spirits, because that was the main thing they needed, was hope. We created what we call the Warm Spring Spirit. And we had such a wonderful time. We would have card parties and dancing. Ladies, you have not laughed until you have seen men in tutus and leg braces do a can-can dance. And then every day about 5 o'clock, we'd have a little cocktail party that Mr. Roosevelt called the Children's Hour. No children about. And even though it was during Prohibition, it never kept him from his little sippy. Well, that went on for several years. In 1928, though, the Democratic Party came calling for him. Al Smith, who had been governor of New York, was the nominee for president, and he wanted some help in New York State, which, as you know, was the most populous state in the country at that time, and still is. And he wanted FD to run for governor. Well, I was very much opposed. I kept saying, don't you dare, FD, don't you dare. But he did dare, and he did, and he got elected by a whisker. Mr. Smith, unfortunately, fell to the Republican nominee, Herbert Hoover. So in 1929, Mr. Roosevelt took office in New York on January 1st. Mr. Hoover waited until March, as was the constitutional rule at the time. And then in October of that year, the stock market crashed, and that was the beginning of our Great Depression. As governor of New York, Mr. Roosevelt was willing to try anything. And if he said it's one thing doesn't work, we'll try another. But above all, try something. Mr. Hoover made some small moves, but he had a very hard time thinking what was likely impossible for the federal government to do. He didn't want us to be helping individuals, even if they were starving and homeless. Mr. Roosevelt, on the other hand, felt a great compassion for all Americans who were suffering and felt that we all needed to lift each other up. So in 1932, he knew the time had come to run for president, and he was nominated, promising a new deal for the American people. By the fall of 1932, November, the momentum was behind him, and he carried all but 4 states. I have to say that the top vote giver in the country was South Carolina, 98% of the vote going to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I sometimes wonder about the 2% that maybe they were postmasters, and if Herbert Hoover lost his job, they would also lose theirs. But at any rate, we took office in March, and in the first 100 days, Mr. Roosevelt sent up to Congress 15 major pieces of legislation that were passed without a whimper. They included banking reform, agricultural reform, federal emergency relief. And then one night he said, I think it's time for a beer. Well, Congress had already repealed passed legislation repealing the 18th Amendment, which brought prohibition, that disaster, into effect. And we were waiting for ratification of the states. But Mr. Roosevelt asked Congress to modify the Volstead Act to allow for the drinking and sale and production of light beer and wine. It was passed, and a big beer truck led by horses pulled up in front of the White House from the Bush Brewery, and we all had a big case of beer that night to celebrate. So we know that things are not over yet for the Depression and not over yet for people struggling with polio, but I'm going to take off my hat, let my hair down just a bit, and let my biographer, Kathryn Smith, tell you a little bit more of the story. Okay, you Massachusetts folks, I am a Southerner. I have never lived outside of Georgia and South Carolina. How did I do with the accent? Yes? Oh, I see a clap. Okay, Good. Well, I'm fortunate enough. I've been married for more than 40 years to a man who was born in Rhode Island. His entire family is from Massachusetts. So I've been to a lot of family reunions and sort of picked up the lingo that way. But Missy was indeed from Massachusetts, did indeed have this accent. She worked for Franklin Roosevelt until the very beginning of his term. In talk, she mentioned that she had had rheumatic fever, and she suffered a severe stroke when she was only 44 years old and died at age 47. But she was very loyal to FDR, had become what we think of today as White House of Staff, and she was his main liaison between his office and Warm Springs, where the polio patients were sent. She was very involved in the March of Dimes, which FDR started, and which eventually funded all the research resulted in the polio vaccine. It came out in 1845, April 12th, 1955, exactly 10 days before from FDR's death of a cerebral hemorrhage at the Little White House, which he loved so much. Missy had died 9 months before, and FDR paid for all of her medical care and then also left half of the income of his estate for her medical support, half to his wife Eleanor. Since she died first, it was all moot, but he left it in his will, and the Roosevelts paid for her burial and plot at the Mount Auburn Cemetery, and they set up an endowment, so they are still covering the cost of maintaining her grave. It's a beautiful place. If you've ever been to Mount Auburn, Missy loved the color pink. She always painted her offices pink and her room pink. And there's a big, huge boulder of pink granite there marking her grave. So at this point, I like to ask for questions and answers. I know a good bit about FDR and his fight for polio, the early years of the March of Dimes, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Did he start the March of Dimes?
He did indeed. He founded the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis in, I'm not sure if it's 37 or 38, but it got its more popular name from a fundraising campaign that the comedian Eddie Cantor started. There was it's very at movie theaters at the time, you would see the feature, but on ahead of the feature you would see the March of Time, which was a newsreel. It was also a radio regular feature, and Eddie Cantor played on that March of Time with the March of Dimes, and he said, send your March of Dimes to the White House, and they came in by the tens of thousands. It took months for the White House to get them all swept out and sent over to the Treasury Department. Imagine that happening today. So that was, yes, he founded the March of Dimes. So we can really thank him and his work for finding the polio vaccine.
Oh. Other questions?
If anybody wants to ask anything, you can unmute yourselves. I've given you the ability to unmute.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kathryn, can you tell us a little bit about the Rotary's involvement with eradicating polio?
Well, of course, in the United States, most of us have never even thought about polio. I guess we all took the vaccine as children, and our children and our grandchildren are still given the polio vaccine, because even though it's eradicated in in America and most of the first world in the 80s, it still was going on in big sections of the world. So Rotary joined up with the World Health Organization and the public ministries for health in countries all over the world to do what they call Polio Plus. Mm-hmm. Was a big campaign. They hope to eradicate polio. They keep, and it just seems like the deadlines gets a little bit farther, the line in the sand or whatever, but we've got it down to 2 countries. Not surprisingly, they are Afghanistan and Pakistan, war zones. There has been a lot of misinformation spread around especially among Muslim clerics, and a lot of distrust about the West. So it's been hard to vaccinate children, but the amount of polio in the world has been reduced to 1% of what it was. So hundreds of thousands of people has been spared death and disability because of Rotary's project. So we continue raising the money to keep vaccinating children and finally wipe it out. It would be the second disease ever wiped out, the first being smallpox. Let's see, someone asked a question. Yes, was it FDR involved at all? He was not. He had died before the research began, but the March of Dimes that he started moved on. In his day, the March of Dimes was mostly a support organization to help people with braces and iron lungs. There was a huge outbreak of polio in Hickory, North Carolina in the 40s, and the March of Dimes came in and just brought in teams of nurses and iron lungs. They took an old camp and turned it into a hospital almost overnight with volunteer labor, and they eventually quarantined all the people in North Carolina with polio until they could get the outbreak under control. So the FDR paid for braces and therapy. It paid for people to go to rehab centers like Warm Springs, which operated as a polio center until the 60s. Today, it is still in operation. It's run by the state Voc Rehab in Georgia, and it's for people who've had any kind of a brain injury or disabled physically or mentally. So it's still a very active organization for the disabled. Other questions?
I just want to say that we have an associate member, Teresa, who is a nurse. She's with us right now, and she would tell us about the my God, how laborious the iron lung was. Teresa, do you want to make a comment on that? I know you had firsthand experience. I bet can she hear me?
She can hear you.
She needs to unmute.
Yeah.
Or maybe she has to unmute. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me find her. Teresa, go ahead. You should be able to.
So everybody, if you're not familiar with how to unmute yourself, you're just going to take your mouse and go to that bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Look at your Zoom screen, go to that bottom left-hand corner. You'll see a little mute button. Everybody can click it. Just go ahead and click it. We'll go down to that bottom left-hand corner. We can see if you haven't unmuted. So just do that right now. Bottom left-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner.
Teresa, did you find it? Looks like
a little microphone.
There she goes.
Okay. Do you have it now?
Yes, Teresa. Yes, go right ahead.
You can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry. You mentioned the outbreak in Carolinas. I don't know if some of us remember. 1955, we had a horrendous outbreak in Boston. And it was interesting that was the year that Salk found the vaccine, but otherwise it was like a MASH hospital in some of the hospitals in Boston, and we were hired as nurses to take care of people with the polio, with the iron lungs. And Mitzi is smiling because she was in high school at the time. And I got a job. I was working. They trained us to use iron lungs, which nobody knew how to use. And that was the only way people were able to breathe, a lot of them. But that was 55. That was the year Salk found the vaccine. And in 1956, Sabin found the vaccine. So it wasn't that, to me, it wasn't that long ago, but some of you may not remember those times. It was a horrendously desperate time in Boston, and it was all young children and younger adults who were stricken.
And I think that may be the thing that's been so different between that and the COVID. Is that the COVID illness is primarily up to now has affected older people who had other problems, but now it's starting to affect children. I've been following a little girl who was 2 in Florida who had COVID, and she's been back in the hospital 4 times since then, just terrible breathing difficulties. So I think that if COVID initially had affected children, we wouldn't have all this balking about taking vaccines. Someone asked, how does
Interesting.
research show about the effectiveness of the warm springs on the course of polio? It was minimal. I think that the physical therapy, the hydrotherapy, which is used for all sorts of things. But what happened at Warm Springs is they developed all sorts of orthopedic treatments. Many people went there as young people repeatedly to have orthopedic surgery. And, as their bones grew and that kind of thing, they had a first-rate brace shop. And then also that Warm Spring spirit that gave people a feeling of wholeness and ability and hope was very, very important. I think the psychological effects of Warm Springs were maybe as important as anything else that happened there.
But I wonder if, did FDR, was he able to ever stand on his own, or, because you always see him in a wheelchair?
No.
Or seated, so he
No.
was not, that never happened, right?
The only way he could stand and move was if he was in braces from his waist all the way down. And he developed this sort of political walk where he would have his full set of braces on, lock the knees, hold on to someone with his left arm so hard that he left fingerprints and bruises on that person's arm, and then used his cane and kind of swing himself from the shoulders forward. It was very tricky, and he just made a big show of it. He'd be laughing and throwing his head back and all that. But by the time he got to his destination, he was just covered with sweat, and so was the person who was holding him up. So no, he never did. But it's been called FDR's splendid deception that almost nobody knew that he was paralyzed from the waist down. He could not get out of his car. He could not get out of a chair by himself. But he was so big, and his shoulders, he had an unusually large head, that when you saw him sitting in his car or sitting at his desk or whatever, he just looked like this big, vigorous, healthy man. Yeah. So that's how he did it.
How involved was his mother with Eleanor? I mean, was she a big part of it?
That's another story.
Oh, it's another story. She was just the mother-in-law. She was the mother-in-law from hell. Yeah, she adored Franklin Spoiler, who's her only child. She was it was a May-December marriage. Her husband was 25 years older than she was, and when Franklin was initially got polio, she wanted him to come home to Hyde Park and just retire and be a country squire and run their farms. And Eleanor, Missy, and Louis Howe, who was FDR's political guru, all thought that he should continue to fight to get back into public life. But yeah, she was, Mrs. Roosevelt, Sarah Roosevelt, was very difficult, made Eleanor's life pretty hellacious. And finally, when Eleanor became First Lady of New York and then First Lady of the country, she was able to kind of shake off her mother-in-law and do her own life. Someone asked, what do you know about post-polio syndrome? That's been discovered in the last couple of decades, that people who had recovered from polio, all of a sudden they start having the symptoms of weakness in their legs and limbs again. And it's just sort of a matter of wearing out your muscles and your nerves from overuse. So, but it's a real syndrome that's very troubling. I met a lady when I was first promoting this book in a wheelchair, and she said she had been able to walk for decades, and then all of a sudden she's back in a wheelchair again. Wow. My talk is based on my book, The Gatekeeper, which is the biography of Marguerite LaHand. It came out a few years ago from Simon & Schuster, and you can still find copies of it on Amazon.
Excellent.
Kathryn, are there any numbers on how much has been raised by the Rotary for polio? And
oh yeah, if you go to Rotary.org, you can look all that stuff up, right down to probably what they were raised yesterday. But it's been hundreds of millions of dollars, and then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has contributed a lot, and the World Health Organization and the ministries of other countries. So really, our contribution is not the top amount, but what we've been able to do is really important, and also the involvement of local Rotary clubs in delivering vaccines and building trust in their own countries about this has just been vital. Yes. So I had the reason I got so involved with Polio Plus is I had cancer 21 years ago, and FDR became kind of my hero, because I looked at what he'd overcome at age 39. I was 43, and after I recovered, I said, I want to do something to pay him back. So that's when I got really involved in raising money for Polio Plus.
That's wonderful.
How serious is it in Afghanistan and Pakistan?
It's not huge. It's, a few hundred people, maybe at the very, very least, usually under 100. But the thing with polio is once it gets a grip again, there's no stopping it. So you got to keep beating it down and beating, before, 3 or 4 years ago, the numbers were down, a dozen or so. It was really on the run. And then between the war and COVID and all that, it keeps ratcheting back up. So I hope that now that COVID is finally receding, that we can start vaccinating widely again. Other questions?
Anyone else with questions?
So polio is still a vaccination for children?
Yes.
The polio.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was Missy's relationship with FDR platonic?
Oh, what a personal question. I'm so glad that Missy's left. She would just be so embarrassed. I'm just kidding. There's no, I think it was. She had, I think she adored him. She adored him. She was about 12 years younger than he was. And he was such a charismatic personality. There were plenty of men and women who just laid their lives down for him, his whole staff pretty much. So I do think she adored him. She adored Eleanor too. She was very fond of Eleanor, and she enabled Eleanor to be the wonderful first lady she became because she took her place. When Eleanor didn't want to be hanging around the White House being the good hostess, she had Missy to depend on. From the 1933 to about 1940, Missy was involved with the U.S. ambassador to first Russia and then to France, William Bullitt. But I got the feeling she really liked him better on his side of the Atlantic Ocean, so, where she could kind of write letters and he'd send her perfume and that kind of thing. But once he got home, it's like, you're bugging me. So I think she really loved her work at the White House, loved the other staff. They were very close-knit. Really talked about the White House family, and it really was a family. And I think that when she finally had to go back to Massachusetts, she felt very sad and abandoned.
Really?
Because she just couldn't do her job anymore. She was partially paralyzed and lost her ability to speak for the most part. So it was very sad.
And so young too. She was
and so young. People who had rheumatic fever in that part of the century very rarely lived to be more than older than 50.
Is that right?
Because there really wasn't anything they could do about it, and they didn't have antibiotics really. So all the things, today, there isn't hardly any rheumatic fever, but she would have had a valve replacement done, and that would have prolonged her life, and antibiotic treatment for illness. But there just wasn't much they could do. So.
You don't hear about rheumatic fever anymore, right? Is it?
It's one of those diseases like scarlet fever and all the other stuff that just kind of went away.
Yeah.
With antibiotics.
Tell us about your book. Tell us about your book. Tell us about your book a little bit.
The Gatekeeper.
Yes.
Well, I think by Missy talking, I've pretty much told it, but it's her biography. It's the first biography ever written of Marguerite Lahan. She'd been mentioned in lots of other biographies, and I wanted to read her life story, and I checked in with the archivist at Hyde Park, the FDR library, and he said no one's ever written one. And I thought, well, doggone it, I'll write one myself.
Good.
And with just all the dumb luck in the world, I found an agent in New York, and Simon & Schuster bought the book. So I was an overnight success at 60.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
So and then I kind of developed this Missy talk around that. I became great friends with her great nieces, Barbara and Jane. In fact, we were together a few weeks ago in Charleston. They were so helpful, and they've adopted me as their Southern cousin. They're both from
course.
Massachusetts. Jane now lives in Connecticut, and Barbara in Virginia. But just terrific, terrific women. Their parents are Missy's nieces, who she doted on as if they were her own daughters, and they're very proud
That is
of
nice.
her. Yeah. Now my latest book,
Oh,
it'll be backwards but it's called Baptist and Bootleggers. It's about prohibition.
oh, tell us about that a little bit.
It's actually, it looks at prohibition through the lens of the South, because we banned alcohol before the rest of the country, which meant basically that we got really, really good at producing it and shipping it north. Our distribution channels were in place by the time the rest of the country went dry in 1920. So we were running rum off the Florida coast and the South Carolina coast and the North Carolina coast, and we were making moonshine in the mountains and all that kind of thing. But it's good talks. I had a really great time writing it. My husband Leo and I went on all these prohibition expeditions. We went all the way down through, we went to Louisville, Kentucky, and drank bourbon for a weekend at different distilleries. We found Carrie Nation's childhood home, which was in the middle of a cow pasture in Kentucky. We went down to Miami Beach and rented a motorboat and a captain to drive by Al Capone's house, and all that kind of thing. And then we went to the Georgia Moonshine Festival in Dawsonville, which was really a trip. Do we have a moment before I can just read a little bit from it?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay.
All
right,
I have
this
a
is-
question. I have
Okay.
a question before you start reading. Were the bootleggers Baptist?
Oh no, the Baptists were the ones who wanted to get rid of bootlegging, and the bootleggers were the ones that wanted it. But think about it this way: both
I knew
Baptists
something I
and yeah, they were on opposite sides, but they both wanted the same things. The bootleggers wanted to get rid of alcohol, especially on Sundays. That was the Baptists. The bootleggers wanted to get rid of legal alcohol because that opened up the field for them to make all kinds of money. So this is from the chapter called Making Moonshine. And by the way, you can buy this book on Amazon now.
Great.
It just came out.
Oh.
Are these what I think they are? I was standing in the Dawsonville Moonshine Distillery during the Mountain Moonshine Festival in this small Georgia town that claims to be the birthplace of stock car racing, peering into a glass case full of long, curved bones. The label read, Coon Dicks, $6.54. Coon Dicks? The pretty young woman behind the counter told me that, yes, that's just what they are, male raccoon genitalia. She explained that they are considered lucky, given to significant others as a sign of affection, and worn in hatbands. While privately reflecting that I would rather be given good jewelry as a sign of affection than a coon dick, I was reminded for the 100th time that day that I had entered a different world when I traveled down the Thunder Road. So a Thunder Road was where the moonshine drivers went down in their 39 Fords going, 100 miles an hour, trying to escape the law and delivering their hooch to big cities like Atlanta. And that's how stock car racing got started.
Oh, I can't wait to
Really?
read your new book. Honest to God. I just
Now, if you could guess, which political party do you think the people in Dawsonville, Georgia, supported before the election last year?
I don't know. Somebody know? I guess. Who's got the
I think they probably went about 98% for Trump, would be my guess.
Wait, when you
Anyway,
going back to that first beer that you mentioned with FDR, and was that the Clydesdale? I mean, did they just?
it was. That was the beginning of the Clydesdales. Yeah, sure was. And they also delivered a beer, a case of beer to Al Smith in New York, and Al Smith was had been the governor of New York and was one of the prominent wets in the Democratic Party. So they brought one to him also.
Fantastic. What a great
Mm.
night. You're so knowledgeable. This is a wonderful program. Any other
Well,
questions?
thank you. It's been
Really
fun
good.
being with you. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if you're interested in following more about Prohibition and Roosevelt and all that, I have a blog on, I'm going to type it in for everyone. It's called bootleggers.substack.com. Oops. Yeah, I just put it in. You can join it for free. And I share a lot of stuff about FDR, about Prohibition, and I put a cocktail recipe of the week on it every Wednesday. So, and then I'm also serializing a novel I wrote that has Missy LeHand as the Nancy Drew, the New Deal, called Shirley Temple is Missing. So there have been 2 episodes of that, but if you sign up, you can go back and read the first 2, and then the third one runs on Saturday. A friend and I started writing Missy LeHand mysteries, and we've written 4, and all but the first one have a very strong polio story to them. So
Oh my
jump in.
God.
Hmm.
I'm so
Yeah,
happy that
thank
Jean
you.
I'm so happy that Jean found you. I mean, what a gift you are tonight.
Oh,
Any
thank you.
questions? Anybody out there have any other questions for Kathryn?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think you're multi-talented.
Well, thank you for being great Rotarians. I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Greater Anderson, as I've mentioned, and we all are part of a really great organization.
We really
So,
are.
all right. Thanks.
Thank
Y'all have a
you.
great evening. Bye
Thank
bye.
you, Kathryn.
Thank
That
you,
was wonderful.
Kathryn.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night.
you so much.
Good night.
Night.
And everyone out there, we thank you all for joining all the guests tonight. And I thank Jean because Jean found her. And did she do something for the society? For the
Yeah, Historical Society. Yep.
Yeah.
She did the whole Missy LeHand.
I got to
job.
get some of her books. So thank you, Jean. That was great. And just to some of Rotarian members out there, I just want to say that we are going to have another meeting at the library on the 27th of October, Wednesday, the 27th, because we do have a couple of we have an agenda that we have to complete by the end of the year, and then we want to talk about our plans for next year. But I just want to say again, thank you for the guests that have joined us. If you wanted to learn anything more about Rotary, just ask anyone. Or we're on. Just go to our website. Or go to our club runner, and you'll find out a lot about us, and you'll find out if you need any information or our websites. We'd love to have you ask more about the Rotary. I think the Rotary is great. My members out there and everyone else, thank you for tonight's program and joining us. And we have a great. Jean, do you want to tell them a little bit before we close about the November 10th program?
Oh, okay. On November 10th, we will be at the Scituate Senior Center, and we will be doing a program called Lines of Fire. And what it is, it's a staged reading of extraordinary letters from war. We have letters that go back to the Revolutionary War. We have a letter from a gentleman who was at Ford's Theater the night that Abraham Lincoln was shot. We have all kinds of, there are entertaining ones, there are heart-wrenching ones, there are thought-provoking. I've got a group of actors, professional actors that I perform with. I've put this program together. We've done it at the State House. We've done it at the Old North Church. We've done it in Scituate many times. And we're going to bring it to the Senior Center for the Rotary. We're hoping that we'll have some veterans that will be joining us. But if not, it's open to the public. We're going to have a wonderful meal before we start. And we'd really love you to join us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, everybody. Good night. Safe traveling in your living room. And we hope to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Raphael.
Thank you.
Go.
Good night, everybody.
It was fun. It was great fun.
Bye.